in prayer. Earlier on, some of you missed this, but I have an icon of St. Francis on my guitar. I've written 2 songs of his that are probably my most well-known songs. He's very important to me. But who was he? So he was born in 1181 in Italy. He was called Francisco because he's called Francis because he was nicknamed Francesco, which means the French one. His dad was French. His dad was a cloth merchant. No, forgive me, it was his mother who was French. And they would go to France a lot, and they bring cloth from France to Assisi in Italy. He had many siblings, and he died when he was 44, and for 20 of those years he was a monk. And he founded 3 orders, 3 new monastic orders that still exist today. The third order, which is for everyday people like you and me, has 350,000 active members. So he wasn't always a monk. He grew up in a rich merchant family, as I said, and his mum used to say that our son behaves more like a little prince than our son. He was the life of the party. I think he was a playboy who was maybe a little bit spoiled and quite rich. And one of the things he really wanted to do was be a hero. So at the age of 20, he joins the military and he goes off to fight a war, and he gets captured. And he spends a year in prison. He gets very ill. And then he comes home and he goes back to war. He gets captured again. Gets ill again. And then he comes back and he's no longer the same as he was. Now, that's so true of many people. Many of you will know people who went to war and came back very different. My grandfather, who was also a minister that I will tell you about one day, his faith emerged in the trenches of World War I. Back to St. Francis. So after he has spent time in prison and ill and broken, he starts to have, he doesn't fit in anymore. He starts to have a lot of tension with his father in particular, who beats him and often locks him in the cellar. And then he has, on top of that, a mystical experience that completely changes his life. I would say ruins his life. It's like a landmine that goes off and the pieces never go back together again. So he's in this ruined chapel praying, and the crucifix on the wall speaks to him, and it says, "Francis, Francis, go and repair my house, which as you can see is in ruins." Francis, Francis, go and repair my house, which as you can see is in ruins. Now Francis, being very eager, takes the message literally. And what does he do? He goes to the priest and says, "I need to rebuild this ruined chapel. Please give me money." And they say, "No." So he goes, and I think he probably asks his father first, and his father says no. So he just steals cloth and sells it to buy materials, and he starts rebuilding this chapel. Meanwhile, his father comes back from being on a business trip, finds out what St. Francis is doing, and goes nuts. He goes completely crazy. He beats him up and locks him up and calls the king's court, which is presided over by the bishop, and has his son tried for theft. And in that process, Francis denounces his father, denounces that lifestyle. He strips off his clothes, and the story is that he's completely naked in front of all the people in the square of Assisi and walks off to start this new life. One of my absolute heroes is Peace Pilgrim, and I remember watching a documentary about her, and she was asked, "Peace, what is your secret?" And she said, "I have a secret, but I would not call it that. There was a time long ago when I died. I died utterly to myself." I think this ego death and absolute transformation happened to St. Francis too. So he's about, I think, maybe 22, 21 at this time, and he spends the next few years dressed in a beggar's robe because he had to find something to put back on. That's where the Franciscan brown habit comes, and the string. It literally was a sack and a piece of string. And he walks the countryside, he begs for food. He's seen as a complete weirdo, a madman. He talks to the birds a lot. He's been this huge shame to his family. Everybody knows who he is. He's the laughingstock of the community. He also scrubs pots in monastery so that he can get food, and he continues to rebuild ruined chapels. And then he starts preaching to not just the birds, but the poor. So he's wandering around, he has no family, no home, no job, nothing taking his energy. He's very present in the moment, and he's living a Christ-centered life. So by the age of 25, a major transformation has happened, because people start listening to him. He starts befriending people, and his love and kindness win over the fact that they think he's really weird. And by the time of 27, there's a lot of people joining him. He's got many other monks and nuns as well, because he's befriended a noble woman called Clare. And St. Clare is his very good friend, and she has her own version of the friars. And the women were not so free and able to just exist in the cities the way the men were, but the two orders still exist. So what was this new way of being? It was pretty simple. They were not copying the traditional monastic model of St. Benedict, where the monks were in behind walls, in a nice place, far away from the people. They were begging on the streets. They owned nothing. They were completely itinerant, and they would preach to whoever would listen. And they were married to poverty, and that poverty gave them a real freedom. It's not just, when people traditionally think about possessions, and when Jesus says do not own things, they think that bondage are the possessions as bondage, and that it makes us stingy and not able to share, but it also means that we have to look after the things that we own. Often people say to me, why don't you have a boat? There's no way I'm going to have a boat. Do you know how much care is required in maintaining a boat? So, one of the other things about the way of St. Francis was, I think he was pretty immune to corruption and the privileges of power, because he would give everything away. He couldn't be bought or sold. And as more and more people followed him, he went to the Pope in Rome and asked for permission to form a new type of monks. They're called friars instead of brothers. And the Pope said that it was too difficult, what St. Francis was asking, to live with poverty and have no security, was just too difficult. But he granted permission, and that was the start of this huge new Franciscan movement. Now at the start, and Doug was reading it as well, I quoted Father Richard Rohr, who is probably the most famous Franciscan, well, other than the Pope, who is called Pope Francis, but he's actually not a Franciscan. Richard Rohr is a Franciscan friar. And he talks about how strange it is that there's this bird bath image of St. Francis who hangs out in the garden and is nice to animals, when the reality was there was this whole other social justice radical side that Francis rebuild my church was the body of the church. It wasn't just the ruined chapel. And he radically changed Christianity. Thank God. For me, he pulled the baby out of the bathwater, and I think that's part of why I love him so much. Here's my favorite story about St. Francis. So it was the time of the Crusades, and the Fifth Crusade is going to Egypt to kill the nasty Muslims. St. Francis is going with them to try and persuade them not to do this, to try and get the soldiers and the knights not to fight. And they laugh at him. They don't listen to him. So what does St. Francis do? He walks out into no man's land to meet the enemy, and they capture him. And then he's there for like 5 days and nobody knows what's happened. And what's happened is he's befriended the Sultan. And after, I don't remember whether it's 5 days or 2 weeks, he returns back to Italy. And he's a wonderful example of loving everybody. And when you love everybody, you have no enemies. I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about the ways that I connect with St. Francis and what he has taught me and how that affects my own spirituality. So the main thing St. Francis has taught me is about praise. He's the best example of praise I've ever seen. And bear in mind that he hit rock bottom as a young man. He has an extreme frame of reference, being beaten, imprisoned, sick in a dungeon for a year, for absolutely failing, for giving up entirely on his old life. You know, in Scotland we say, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And Khalil Gibran has a lot to say about this. That prophet talks about our capacity for joy is linked and inseparable from our capacity for sorrow. That one goes hand in hand with the other, and the depth for one becomes the capacity for the other. I believe that the teachings of Jesus don't really make sense or open enlightenment until we've hit adversity, shame, and failure. Knock and you shall find works better when you are desperately knocking on that door. Truly, blessed are the poor in spirit. So without that context, now that I've said that, I want to share with you my version of Canticle of Creation. So it's also called Canticle of the Sun, and it is the first written piece of literature in the Italian dialect. Before that, everything that's recorded is in Latin, and this is a song, a canticle, that St. Francis wrote. Now we've lost the melody, but the words remain, and I was commissioned to set this into song, and it took me over a year. I do paraphrase St. Francis, and I have to say my theology is a little bit different, but I hope he would be proud. Most High, all-powerful, precious God, no spoken word can hold your name. Praise be to you who births all life with all your creatures. Especially you, sir, brother, son, who is the day and is your light, a beauty so true to you. There you are, there you are. Praise be to you, my Lord, you are. Sister moon and the stars, bright precious heaven, there you are, there you are. Praise be to you, my Lord, you are brother wind and the air, breath of spirit, there you are, there you are. Praise be to you, my Lord, you are sister water, gift of life, pure, essential, there you are, there you are. Praise be to you, my Lord, you are brother fire, friend through the night, strong and playful, there you are, there you are. Most high, all-powerful, precious God, through Mother Earth we see your face. You who govern all of life, sustain and nurture all that is. With sister death, first and last breath, the key unlocking all we are, there we are. There we are. There we are. So my sense of praise, which is deeply inspired by St. Francis, is that praise is a vital part of how we co-create with God. In a very real way, the world becomes what we see it to be. So when St. Francis sees through a lens of love, and not just human love, but an enormous, expansive, godly love, miraculous things happen all around him. And I believe this happened because he deliberately and carefully embodied and infused his worldview into his actions. He walked his loving talk. He didn't just agree with Jesus about hoarding wealth. He full-heartedly adopts poverty as his bride with abandon and joy. He embodies his faith and he alters everything to make that come into fruition. Another aspect of praise that I've learned from St. Francis is that he would call earth the mirror of God. Now, there's a beautiful Sufi practice of polishing the heart. And you polish the spiritual muscle of your heart through self-reflection and prayer and generosity. And you do this because the more that you polish your heart, the more you can reflect God's light. So when St. Francis sees God there, beautifully mirrored in creation, somehow he's able to harness and receive some of that power. Praise isn't just about responding with gratitude, which is part of it. It's also about witnessing, beholding the mystery right there, and somehow placing the gift of life into our hands and sharing it. Miraculous things happened all around St. Francis. Healing, forgiveness, generosity. He's the first person that is recorded as having the stigmata on his body, a real embodiment of the Christ consciousness. People joined him, devoting their lives to God and following Christ. Hundreds and thousands of people, maybe millions over the 1,000 years since he was alive. Why did they do this? Well, it's because St. Francis had something that the people wanted and craved. He has a closeness with God. And he expresses it as a magnetic love that just draws you in. That, I think, is why he is the world's most loved saint. When we realize how loved we are, we love back. And we are changed and transformed by it. Love isn't just the force that connects us, it's the force that birthed this universe. It is the energy that then takes action and becomes life. St. Francis said yes to life and love. And it was infectious, and that is why we all love St. Francis. And one more thing, what he told his monks to do was to imitate Christ. That is the secret of what his monks were doing, to imitate people who knew God. And that's what I'm going to expand that, because I don't know all of your belief systems. And a teaching I tell people over is, please imitate those who know God. It's like a spiritual practice for dummies, and it works. So imitate whoever it is. St. Francis, Christ, the Dalai Lama, Oprah Winfrey, or your granny. I'm going to close with St. Francis. This is what he said. It's my favorite quote. I once spoke to my friend, an old squirrel, about the sacraments. He got so excited and ran into a hollow in his tree and came back holding some acorns, an owl feather, and a ribbon that he had found. And I just smiled and said, yes, yes, dear, you understand. Everything imparts his grace. Truly, it is a wonderful world. May the blessing of God rest upon you, and Christ's peace abide in you, and the Spirit illuminate your heart, now and forevermore. Dear ones, thank you for coming to church on Zoom. I've got another service that I have to run off to, but please stick around for coffee hour, and I'll see you next week.